Good morning. Sunday morning. Normally I don't do shows on Sunday because I got day 0 later, but I think it's Sunday. Is it Sunday? Let me triple check that. Hey, what do you know? I was right. It is Sunday. So, but yeah, I'm going to go over some stuff because I feel like it. So, obviously, the person of my obsession is Marguerite Oswald. And I'm starting to wade through this fucking mess of weird, not quite right, and sometimes contradictory information. I seem to be obsessed with 126 Exchange Place. Still trying to figure out the weird overlaps we have there. Because remember, they're not alleged to have moved in there until early 1955. March or April of 55. May at the latest, 55. But it doesn't make sense because I have postmarked envelopes from October of 1954 from 126 Exchange Place from Marguerite Oswald to John Pick in New York. So we have absolute shenanigans going on here, right? Can't seem to get over this. And nobody else has figured it out because nobody else incorporates the idea that there were two Oswalds, and there were. Jesus Christ, at this point, when I reread the testimony of James Wilcott, the alleged Atsugi accountant for the CIA, more and more about what he says seems to make sense, but it seems to also incorporate that there was a larger scale Oswald project that involved other Oswald families. Why, I don't fucking know. Who the hell knows? We'll never know. But when it comes to our Marguerite, all roads seem to lead to naval intelligence. And you know, a lot of times researchers overlook routing sheets, right? So you'll get an FBI report and it'll have a routing sheet on it and it'll say who's it from, who's it going to, what's it about, what relevant dates are here, you know, that kind of stuff, boring stuff. Stuff that when you look at, you're just like, okay, it's a lot of codes and symbols and, you know, you don't really understand what they are, so you just kind of move on. But when you actually take the time to dig into them and research a lot of the stuff that is in a routing sheet, you find some pretty amazing stuff. John Armstrong was really good at this, really good at picking apart these routing sheets, catching little discrepancies and things that are off. So this routing sheet is going to kick off today's episode. John Armstrong knew what the deal was. He knew that Marguerite was unquestionably connected deeply to naval intelligence. So, routing sheet, agency information, FBI, record number 124-10185-10102. Record series HQ. So what I find is like when an FBI record series that's indicated as HQ, from what I've gathered, that'll be the main file surrounding a subject, right? So when they say FBI Marguerite Oswald HQ file, I believe that it's their main file on that subject. Like I just downloaded the Oswald FBI HQ file, and it's pretty fucking long. It's tens of thousands of pages. And it's separate from that is completely separate from the FBI Kennedy documents, the HQ file for those, which are roughly 16,000 pages. So the files on Oswald are way deeper than the assassination, as they should be, because really the nuts and bolts of the assassination are pretty simple. You know, Israel, CIA, Mafia, all one organization, basically 1963. They utilize all the tools at their disposal. They recruit the guys down in New Orleans, and then each of the Mafia guys had to throw somebody in there, right? So you get the three tramps. Really, it comes down to, it's pretty simple. You know, then they got Jack Kaysen over at the fucking book depository, which is owned by D.H. Byrd. You know, I mean, this is a This is an orgy of conspirators who all knew each other, who are all in the upper crust of Dallas elite, right? All connected to the mob, because you have to be if you want to do anything in life. Not anymore, I don't think so much. The mob is the government now. But here we go. Document information. Originator, CIT. I don't know what CIT is, but if someone can fill me in on what CIT is, I would suspect it has to do with covert intelligence or counterintelligence task force, maybe. From Marguerite Oswald to... Why it says from Marguerite Oswald doesn't make any sense. From Marguerite Oswald to, it says no title, date 4/28/60. So this is before the assassination by 3.5 years. Page is 986. So we have a file that's 986 pages long, and it's referencing Marguerite Oswald. But I'd love to get my hands on this. Obviously, it doesn't exist, because if there was a 986-page file on Marguerite Oswald, I would have it. So everyone's looking for Oswald information, but nobody really digs for Marguerite Oswald information, and that's all the stuff they're hiding. 100%. They are hiding their relationship with Marguerite Oswald. And honestly, Marguerite really appears to be a not very smart person. She's kind of a dumb person. She's kind of a greedy person. She doesn't have any connection to her children. What the fuck kind of person? Is this the kind of person that the government recruits? Sociopaths? Because that's what really she is, ultimately. The original Marguerite. The fake Marguerite later on, who we've come to know, who is most likely Pearl Claverie. Possibly Amenth Voitier, but I don't really... and the only connection there, and the only reason that guy Dolan made a connection there is because she was a nurse also. And then our Marguerite suddenly became a fucking nurse. Like, out of the blue, you're just a nurse. You know, no training, no nothing. Boof, you're just a nurse. Right? Fucking... Where was that? Down in... what city was she in? This is right after 59-60. Not Tarrant County. Not Benbrook. One of those other places in fucking Texas where she had a P.O. box, right? All of a sudden, poof, you're a nurse. Give me a fucking break. So, document type, paper, textual document. 986 pages, need I remind you. Subjects, CC, Lee Harvey Oswald, post-Russian period, relatives, associates, Communist Party. CP is every time you see CP in anything Kennedy related, it's usually Communist Party, and it'll usually be associated with Oswald. 926-63, military service, act, inquiry, INSTR, comma, testimony. Instrumental testimony, maybe. RHP, invest, JG. JG has to be Jim Garrison. Okay, that's got to be their secret lingo for Jim Garrison. Classification secret, restrictions 1B, 1C, 2, 4, referred. Current status, released with deletions. Date of last review, 3/28/1995. So this is a ARRB originating document. Opening criteria, indefinite approval of ONI. All right. So let me translate. Opening criteria means if you want access to this 986-page Marguerite Oswald document, you need the approval of the Office of Naval Intelligence. Very interesting, huh? Comments. Referral to ONI. Comma, bulky ENC, comma, INC. Bulky ENC is a bulky enclosure. I think that means it's a big fat fucking file. Bulky enclosure. Include 6 notes, comma, R/S, comma, 13 LTRS, 13 letters, comma, and Armstrong highlighted this. Rap sheet. I've never heard of Marguerite Oswald being arrested. Have you? It's not outside the realm of fucking possibility, considering how much of a absolute fucking disgusting human being she is. In fact, the idea that she hasn't been arrested is kind of ridiculous when I think about it. So rap sheet. She's got a rap sheet that the FBI is aware of and commenting on. Comma 105 memo. I don't know what that is. 4 EXH. Maybe that's 4 exhibits. Comma 4 admin pages. 30 TTY, comma 49 A/T. I don't know what any of that means. Comma 7 RPT7 reports, 2 cablegrams, 10 INTV, 10 interviews, 7 news articles, 15 LHM. God, I see LHM all the time. What the fuck is that? It's God, I forget offhand. It's an FBI term for something, and it's substantial. 9 inserts, 66 statements, comma true copy, comma 2 lab reports, lab reports, comma abstract. Then it looks like it should be continued, or it just ends, but there's never a period at the end of these somewhat sentences. Then it says audit history for this record identification form. All right, so the next page. The next couple pages actually is John Armstrong attempting to make some sense of all the various addresses that Marguerite Oswald has lived at, or claimed to have lived at, or is documented in one way, shape, or form. At this point in time, I can fully relate to the madness that Armstrong is putting himself through. So I'm still trying to interpret how he has these charts laid out, because he made these like grid, like a spreadsheet with various addresses and what years the Oswalds were seen there. Because remember, we have discrepancies on places like 2220 Thomas Place, where during the 1954 to 1955 school year, Oswald was alleged to have been at Stripling. This was kind of confirmed by Frank Kudlady, Franchetta Schubert, and that contradicts the known record on Oswald, right? No need to go into the details on that. You should all be very familiar with the Stripling incident, right? The 6 weeks he is alleged to have been there in the 54 to 55 school year. That it makes sense to me, basically. This is how I see that set of circumstances kind of playing out. It would appear, based on what we know about Oswald's movement from New York, is that from there he went to North Dakota, Stanley, North Dakota. I'm making some progress on North Dakota. Let me just say that. I'm making progress there. I should have that figured out shortly. There might have been familial connections, as well as intelligence connections, as well as military connections, as well as Stanley, North Dakota is very, very close to the Canadian border, which sometime around 1955, 1954, late 54, I believe that I have documentation of Lillian Moret traveling, obviously, to and from Canada. So it kind of just tipped me off that there might have just been some sort of connection between the Stanley incident and Canada. But I'm getting off track here. But like I was saying about 2220 Thomas Place, Marguerite Oswald lived there during the Stripling year, 54-55, but she was also living there at the time of the assassination in 63. There's also some evidence she lived there in the late 50s, 57, 58. So she lived there multiple times through multiple owners. Just like she's alleged to have had multiple properties and been flat broke. You know what I mean? To me, it appears that she's part of some network of housing that was being bought and sold in her name. Because there's no evidence whatsoever she ever collected a rent check from anybody. There's no evidence. There's no testimony. There's no one ever even alleging that she had a tenant living in any of her alleged properties. considering at times she bought like multiple. John Pick said during his testimony that one of the properties she had bought had like either 2 or 4 units, and it had an upstairs and a downstairs. He believed it was a 4-unit place. Liebler thought it was a duplex. But that right there is the only testimony that we have ever that Marguerite Oswald was ever any kind of landlord who owned a property. But he didn't recall her. He didn't recall any other tenants. He didn't recall her going to collect any money from tenants. There's no evidence whatsoever that she collected money from tenants. There's no banking records. There's no checks. There's nothing. But yet we're meant to believe that she owned multiple properties at a time, some of them multiplexes, but there's no financial records of any of it. It doesn't sit well with me. Not at all. And so when you dig into 2220 Thomas Place, it appears to be the same thing. It appears to be that she lived there under the ownership of at least 2 different people. And the owner at the time of the Stripling incident, 5455, the owner, I forget her name offhand, it's in Armstrong's records. Maybe I can come across it here shortly. But she was a friend of Fred Korth, personal friend of Fred Korth. And so the relationship of Fred Korth to the Oswalds needs to be heavily, heavily explored. There's got to be something there. He was from Fort Worth. There's got to be, maybe that was what drew them to Fort Worth in the first place from New Orleans. That happened in what, 44, 45-ish. This would have been after a time. This would have been during a time when she, remember, because Fred Korth was Ekdal's lawyer during the divorce in 48. So we have to assume that Ekdal and Korth were connected all through 45 at the time that they were married. I wouldn't be surprised if we were to find out that Fred Korth was at the wedding of Ekdal and Marguerite. It would make perfect sense. And so Fred Korth being in Fort Worth might be what drew them there in the first place. Well, it might be what drew Ekdal there. Because for a time, Fred Korth's law firm is up in Boston, if I'm not mistaken. Or was it New York? I forget, because remember, everything about Ekdal is alleged to have been in Boston, but when you look at the census records, the guy lived in New York most of his life. So we can't really trust everything about the history of Ekdal as we're told. But sometime around 44, 45, well, it would have been, when they bought the Victor Street house in Dallas? Was that the first time they went to that area? Because then they wouldn't have gone from New Orleans to Fort Worth. They would have gone from New Orleans to fucking Dallas. They were in the orphanage. Prior to that, we've got the fucking missing years, the missing 2.5 years, right? Where I'm claiming that they were in New York. And before that, you got the Pauline Street address. And yeah, so what are you talking about, people? They didn't go from motherfucking... That's another... I just realized this as we're talking here, that the official story that they went from fucking New Orleans to Fort Worth is complete bullshit, because they went from New Orleans to Victor Street in Dallas. So now what does that tell me? It tells me I need to start looking for a conflicting address in Fort Worth while Marguerite, the real Marguerite, Ekdal, and the 3 kids were living in Dallas. And that kind of rings a bell that John Pick said that he had gotten his first job. That was in Fort Worth, wasn't it? So that had to have been after Victor Street. He was working at like the Easy Grocery or something like that. And he also claims to have worked for Dolly Shoe. But remember, I found the Dolly Shoe incorporation paperwork, and it was January of 1955 that they fucking incorporated. So I don't know what the fuck he's talking about there. But I'm getting off track again. So we are on John Armstrong's documentation of Marguerite and Lee's addresses. And they are all over the fucking place. They are all over the place. The weird thing is the letters. The thing that really fucks up everything is the letters. The postmarks on the letters. Because there's numerous times when a letter is sent with a postmark and a return address that doesn't correlate with the known record, right? Like the 126 Exchange Place is a perfect example. Another example would be the, 4800 block of Ewing they lived at. That address was used for like years after they lived there. That was before Victor Street, if I'm not mistaken. I don't recall, actually. I'd have to go through and look it up. Maybe it was just after Victor Street, but their whole lives, there's like there's like mistakes in addresses, like they forget where they're living or forget where they're supposed to be living. I just keep getting the idea that this is some sort of network of people who are being housed. Because you got to think, she had 40-something addresses, and we only know about how many landlords? 3, 4, 5, maybe, out of the 40-something addresses. So, and one of those was, Myrtle Evans, right, at the St. Mary's address. But she had known Myrtle Evans her whole life, and Myrtle Evans ends up popping up in the story several times, right? Pops up in the story at one of her earlier addresses, then at the St. Mary's address, and she will then run into her again in New Orleans in 60 or 61, working at one of those department stores that she had worked at before. I think Cox's was in Fort Worth, maybe, or she worked for so many. But her testimony is fantastic in regards to her seeing the real Marguerite back in New Orleans, because the other Marguerite stayed in Texas for the rest of her life. Never went back to New Orleans. Stayed in Fort Worth, but then she hopped around to Vernon, Texas. Vernon was the city I was trying to think of earlier, where she just had a P.O. box. But something tells me that all the addresses that she had at were just a P.O. box. She wasn't really there. Like at Benbrook, when she comes back and she has just the Grandbrook Road P.O. box, right? Now, give me a fucking break. The story is that her house was the first one built there, the one at San Saba. But I just don't buy any of those stories. The P.O. boxes give away a lot of information. Like, for some reason, Oswald had that P.O. box. What was it? 30061 in Fort Worth. I forget if it was Fort Worth or New Orleans. I haven't gotten to the Russian period or anything after. I'm putting it off because I need to figure this pre-Russian period out first. But he had that P.O. box before he even left fucking Russia. How does that work? How the fuck does that work? How do you have a P.O. box in like Fort Worth or wherever the fuck it was? And you're still in the goddamn Soviet Union. How the fuck is that? Who set what are we talking about here? Who set that up for you? We know that Marguerite had set up bank accounts at the First National Bank and Savings of Fort Worth for Lee, which was ended up closed. It was closed out right when he got out of the Marines. I forget if it was closed out in Fort Worth or Santa Ana. But here, going over this, I'm going to have to screenshot this because this is going to be important. John Armstrong, I could see going through all the phases of madness that I'm going through. But he's got it all laid out here, and there's obvious contradictions in this grid he has set up by year and by the address. And it's crazy, the amount of overlap. You can just look at it and see, and he has notes on the side here. Marguerite Oswald, whether it's in Fort Worth or New Orleans, and he's got the name of the person associated with the address itself, the dates that Lee was there, and the dates Lee was at Beauregard in correlation, and the day, he actually has notation here on October 54 when Lee was in a fight and lost a tooth. So that was in October of 1954. It is around this, see, it's this October 1954 time period that Harvey had moved on to Stripling in Fort Worth, while Lee assumed his position. This is what fucks me up. Like, how are they so stupid? Like, I don't understand. Like, is it audacity? Is it truly just an experiment that they knew they could pull the plug on at any time? But to have somebody there named Lee Harvey Oswald, who goes around calling himself Harvey, and then all of a sudden that student disappears, and there's somebody else there named Lee Harvey Oswald who calls himself Lee, who's obviously a different person. Did they think nobody would notice? See, this is the things that I have a hard time swallowing. Why not just send them to 2 different fucking schools, have one of them listed as Harvey Oswald, have the other one listed as Lee Oswald, leave a middle name out of it, and you'd have gotten away with the fucking... Well, they wouldn't have gotten away with it because Armstrong would have figured all that stuff out easy in the 1990s. But by then, nobody would have gave a fuck, right? Like, it doesn't make sense why they did things some of the way they did. Other than, I can't believe I'm going to say this, but it seems to be a certain level of inexperience, perhaps incompetence. I don't know. If I was tasked with going back in time and having to do this, how would I have done it? I don't know. I would not have had him go to the same school at the same time. I keep running across little bits of information, little possible hints that one of them was perhaps a grade ahead in school. Particularly, this comes from the New York records, where the New York records seem to be pretty adamant that when he entered PS 44 in New York City, because I finally found a document that referenced, an official FBI document that referenced PS 44 in New York City, not in the Bronx, like every other reference. And that was in September of 1953. I totally just forgot what the fuck I was talking about. So back to John Armstrong's document here. He has 1956 highlighted, and he points out as indicated by the directory abbreviation. Like for Marguerite Oswald, it says MGRT, but we also know that in 1955, MGRT Oswald in New Orleans went back to the Telemachus address, which was Margaret Keating, right? Which is that weird anomaly that no one's figured out yet. And I haven't figured it out either. And that's also indicated under the J.R. Michaels, and he has in parentheses January of 56. So we know the move to Fort Worth from New Orleans occurred July 1st, 56, as per Oswald's own hand on the application for Social Security, right? So, or was it the application for enrollment in school? Because I doubt Oswald would be doing his own enrollment in school paperwork. But he has highlighted that time period indicating the J.R. Michael stuff. And the J.R. Michael stuff is really important because that would indicate who was working where, when. And like I've already said, the only people who knew about that and that employment was the FBI under the direction of Hoover directly. So Hoover knew about this employment when nobody else did, not even Social Security, right? So that I thought was very telling. It appears as though John Armstrong still keeps harping on this overlap between 126 Exchange Place and 4936 Collinwood, but I don't see it. I just don't fucking see it. He says they're here from July 1st, 56 to December 31st. Then he has Harvey is at Arlington Heights High School in September, and then Harvey joins the Marines in October. Why he's making a differentiation here, I'm not sure. In the column over here, he has, while this is going on, Marguerite Oswald is still at 126 Exchange Place, but he has January through July of 56, and he has that Lee is working at Tujague's until July. But if you'll notice, there's no conflict here. I don't see conflict here. I don't understand why he thinks there's conflict here. Because I just don't see it. I just don't see conflict. You want to talk about conflict, talk about the early days of 126 Exchange Place. Talk about January through May of 1954. That's fucking conflict. But here in this July period where it's acknowledged that there was a move to Fort Worth, I just don't, unless, and he hasn't said this here or anywhere else that I've found, that there's evidence that Marguerite Oswald was still living at 126 Exchange Place past July of 1956, because I just haven't seen that anywhere. Then in 1957, he has highlighted the name Mildred Sawyer. Mildred Sawyer and her husband were living at 126 Exchange Place, and they remember Marguerite. Well, he died. Her husband died, and she was a widow, and she was living there and was interviewed, I believe, at the time of the assassination. So she had been living there for about 8 years at 126 Exchange Place. And she remembered Mrs. Oswald, but I believe she said they only lived there for a year. But the evidence is kind of playing out that Marguerite Oswald and her son were there from January of 1954 all the way through July of 56, so about 2.5 years. And at some point in time in there is a swap-a-roo between the Marguerite Oswalds. So I believe it goes from Harvey Oswald and the false Marguerite sometime prior to the beginning of the 1954-55 school year, which would be September 1954. Sometime prior to that, I believe this is when Robert Oswald kind of slips up in his testimony. Robert Oswald will end up coming to New Orleans and picking up the fake Marguerite and the fake Oswald, Harvey Oswald, driving them to Fort Worth, where then they will move into the Collinwood address. And then the real Marguerite will pitch her fit to Myrtle Evans and her husband Julian and complain about the cost of living at 1454 and 1452 St. Mary's, and we'll be like, we're out of here. And then they will move into 126 Exchange Place sometime around had to have been June of 1956. So to me, the series of events of the false Oswald and then moving into 126 Exchange Place, then moving to Fort Worth, and then the real Marguerite and Lee moving into 126 Exchange Place, where then Lee will continue to go to Beauregard, where he is photographed by Ed Vabell with the missing tooth and all that stuff, right? So we have evidence of all this stuff, right? We have the testimony of Myra DeRoos, who basically said during that September... it was January. It was January of 1954. That's when she met Harvey Oswald, and then the piano fell on him. And that's how we know we have absolute proof that Ed Vabell knew both of the Oswalds at 2 different times, right? Because Ed Vabell is the one who brought Lee Oswald into the Civil Air Patrol under the direction of Mr. Frederick O'Sullivan, future Mossad agent who we'll talk about sometime in the future. But, so that all makes sense to me. But he doesn't really emphasize that enough, I don't feel. He emphasizes too much this switch to the Collinwood address, which really I don't understand. It seems as though he missed some of that early stuff in 1954, or didn't put enough emphasis on it, at least, if he didn't miss it. All right, so we have a bunch of pages of his madness, the grid of dates and times and overlaps and stuff, and there's a lot of it. There's unquestionably a lot of it. Here we have a list that says with an asterisk, above related files and cross-references have been processed, but never placed in FBI HQ reading room. So Armstrong identified a bunch of documents and pages of documents, and what percentage of them were released and placed or not placed into the FBI HQ reading room. So this is an older document. This is from the 90s. Who knows what's come out since? But here it appears that we have a file on Marguerite Claverie Oswald. They're always spelling her fucking name wrong. That I can't figure out for the life of me. Total pages 422, duplicate pages 192. Pages released 180. Percent released 78%. So we've got, what's that? 22% of this 422 pages is not released. Or at least at the time that Armstrong was going through this. Unfortunately, we don't have any other references to where or what these are that we could find. Then Clay Laverne Shaw, total pages 209. Duplicate pages 37, pages released 149, so 87% of the Clay Laverne Shaw FBI HQ files have been released. Where are the rest, and why are they withheld? George de Mohrenschildt, it seems as though he's got the most, 1719 total pages, 155 duplicates, pages released 1432 at 92% released. So that's a good amount. There's a lot out there on George de Mohrenschildt. The stuff you're not going to ever find on George de Mohrenschildt are the files that show that before he even got with the CIA, he was being suspected of being a Nazi spy and all that stuff. That's all, like all the good stuff we're never going to see. All we ever see are, all we'll ever hope to find are echoes of those core files, is what I'll call them. Core files, and we get the echoes that which we have to decipher. We're never going to get the fucking George de Mohrenschildt Nazi files. Give me a break. Ruth and Michael Payne, looks like on Michael Payne, 97% have been released. Ruth Payne, 72%. Again, this is very vague and it's not indicating which particular file sets have been released. David Ferry, 86%. And then we have one on James Hosty, and only 85% of Hosty's files have been released, which is interesting as per Armstrong's notes. It's funny as you go through this and you see these addresses, and he's listed out here the reference to the addresses, right? And so there's a couple anomalies that I'm very interested in. If anybody is interested in studying Marguerite or Margaret or whatever the fuck her real name is, Oswald, some more anomalies we seem to have that nobody has any answers for are particularly the 3830 West 6th, where Oswald sent a postcard while he was in Hawaii very briefly. The address that went very much unacknowledged by the Warren Commission and other peoples, but it's kind of hard to deny when it shows up on a credit report, right? It appears that she lived there for about a year and a half or 2 years. This has major overlap with the 4936 Collinwood. I've yet to really dive into this too much because I'm going chronologically and I haven't gotten there yet. But one thing that I find very interesting coming up is that at some point in time, Marguerite Oswald will have purchased and allegedly lived at 3006 Bristol. I believe that is Fort Worth. The anomaly here is that, number one, I believe that John Pick never knew about this address when he was questioned about it. He didn't know about the Templeton address either, 313 Templeton. And when you look at the notes of John Hart Ely, the Warren Commission lawyer who did some of the questioning during depositions, in his notes, he has 3006 Bristol, but then he crosses it out and he writes 2006 Bristol, 2006 Bristol, and his handwritten notation says, correction by Marguerite Oswald. What correction? This is the only reference in all of this stuff to 2006 Bristol. And since 3006 was crossed out, I'm assuming that Marguerite Oswald corrected it to 2006 Bristol, which I've never fucking heard of 2006 Bristol. Have you? No, not at all. That needs to be dug into for sure. So there's also a note here for that 3006 Bristol address in Armstrong's notes. It says moved out in February or March of 59. But there's also in parentheses, it says Wid Lee, W-I-D Lee. I don't know what that reference means. The following year in the directory, the name that pops up is Jean Hamilton. So Marguerite Oswald is gone by the 1960 local directory. All right, so we have another document here. Originator CIT from, again, says Marguerite Oswald. This is different from the document we saw before. This one is agency file number 62-116395-123X1. Document type, paper textual document. Restrictions, referred. And opening criteria. That's left blank. And then it says indefinite approval of ONI. just like the other document, despite the fact this one's different. So why is it that the Marguerite Oswald file, the big one, big fat one, is being held and is under the discretion of the Office of Naval Intelligence? Which, I'm sorry, but I thought the Office of Naval Intelligence had actually become Navy NCIS by the 60s. Or was there a compartmentalized version of ONI that was maintained for, record-keeping purposes or information purposes? I just don't know. But I thought ONI was defunct by the 60s. I thought they had become Naval Criminal Intelligence Service or whatever the fuck, that stupid TV show that's on there. They tried to hide the fact that they're an intelligence operation, basically. Tried to make it seem more like they were a criminal investigation agency as opposed to intelligence. So as you continue on through this file on Marguerite Oswald, you come across another couple of notations. I've learned over the years to become very adept at reading these. I don't know. This is a Federal Bureau of Investigation's records branch, but I don't know if this is a request document, a routing document, or what it is. But I've seen these 100 times at this point. And this is where, like, when they're getting information, it'll have, like, all the files that a person is associated with, right? So I guess this might be a response to a records request that goes to records that they pull the information from. So that seems pretty reasonable, right? This is dated 12/6/63. Researcher MLW. Subject Marguerite Oswald. File number 105-82555-18 and 105-82555-11. So whenever you see a FBI case number and it has like 105 dash, and then I have another one coming up 97 dash, and then you have like Hoover's secret files were 67 dash. I actually have a list somewhere I used for reference in my book of all these different codes. And that's how I kind of determined that Jack Valenti's father was a fucking straight up mobster scumbag, right? Because I was able to decode all of the various prefixes on these file numbers. So what file numbers do we need to understand for Marguerite Oswald? Number 1 is 105. Number 2 is 97. The next one is 100. Then we have a 65 file. The 65 file underneath it is referenced $25 to Lee in Moscow, 5/17/60. So the 65 might be having to do with something financial, or it might have to do with that operation where they opened everybody's fucking mail, which is still hilarious to me. So we've got at least 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. We have a minimum of 10 FBI files on Marguerite Oswald as of 12/6/63. So within 2 weeks of the assassination, there are numerous files dating back. It doesn't have dates here. Well, let me see. We have one that's got a date of 33. Another one has a date of 44. We don't know. I don't know that these are dates, but I don't see what else they could possibly be. Let me see. This one says Marguerite C. Lee, daughter in tow. I don't know what that means, but that's what it says. Then we have a letter to Mr. J. Lee Rankin from Albert Jenner, delivered herewith are 3 preliminary records prepared by John Eli at my request, made in late February, early March. My purpose was to obtain a chronology based on then existing data in our files of the background facts, life, school, places of residence, etc. of Mrs. Oswald, her several marriages, her husbands, and all 3 children, and in particular Lee Harvey Oswald, from the time she married Mr. Edward John Pick Jr. in the fall of 1929 to the time Lee Harvey Oswald entered military service in October of 56. We plan to employ the memoranda as a guide for the presentation of evidence before the commission for determining the persons and agencies whom we would examine by deposition in Dallas, New Orleans, and New York City, as well as to determine what additional investigation we believe to be necessary or desirable on the part of the FBI or Secret Service or members of the commission staff. Mr. Eli was instructed to resort to whatever material he then found on hand, even including newspaper and magazine materials. It was intended that wherever in the memoranda reliance was placed on magazine and newspaper articles respecting evidence which we concluded must be included in our final report, we would assemble first-hand evidence or data rather than rely on news media reports. Okay, let me pause right here. This, I don't know why it doesn't have the actual fucking letter, but John Eli was pissed because John fucking Eli, he's like, yo, I get more information from Time Life magazine than I get from the fucking FBI. What is going on here? This is bullshit. We need to be getting this information from the FBI firsthand. And how the hell is Time Life magazine getting this information before us? That was John Eli's concern. And let me give you an answer to that. Because Time Life magazine was a fucking CIA endeavor from day one. Who was in charge of fucking Life magazine at the time of the assassination? Derp. C.D. Jackson. What did C.D. Jackson do? Derpa derpa. C.D. Jackson helped fake the Holocaust with all those bullshit props that they planted at Buchenwald, right? And if you don't know about that, you need to fucking look up C.D. Jackson Buchenwald and the fakery that was put forth there. He's the one who started the fucking rumors and the myths of the tattooed lampshades and human skin and the fucking pelvic bone fucking ashtrays and all that stuff. Like, fuck C.D. Jackson to death. Lifelong fucking intelligence operative. Psychological warfare expert. Okay? Give me a fucking break. But he had a good point. John Eli had a good point. Why the fuck is Time Life magazine getting more information on Oswald's background than we are? Let me continue. Mr. Eli's memoranda are well done. They have served as excellent material against which we have proceeded with our testimony presentation before the commission and the taking of depositions in Dallas and New Orleans. On the whole, Mr. Eli's memoranda present a good overall picture of the course of events involving the Oswalds up to the time of Lee Oswald's entry into the military service. Our deposition and examination of records and other data disclose that there are details in Mr. Eli's memoranda which will require material alteration. Okay, let me reread that. Our depositions and examinations of records and other data disclose that there are details in Mr. Eli's memoranda which will require material alteration and, in some instances, omission. Furthermore, some of his speculations have not been borne out by our later work. Okay, so this is what John Armstrong was talking about when he was referring to John Hart Eli starting to become aware of information which would not bear too good for the FBI CIA in regards to the fact that there was two Oswalds. Plain and simple. So I really didn't see that initially when I was reading through a lot of Armstrong's work on Eli, but when you read Eli's work directly, it does seem that he was getting onto something. But I haven't read the actual memoranda from Eli himself. I've read his initial letters, but I haven't read the memoranda that he actually wrote where he outlines all of his work. For the past 3 weeks, Mr. Liebler and I have been devoting our time almost exclusively to the taking of depositions in Dallas and New Orleans. We are now reviewing and digesting our work in that respect to date. It appears at the moment that we find out it's necessary to return to both Dallas and New Orleans and one more time each. We must also take depositions in New York City, and we are preparing to schedule to that end. We do not expect the New York City depositions to involve more than 2 days' time. I thought it well that I admit this memorandum to you so that it might accompany the transmission of Mr. Eli's memoranda to Chief Justice Warren, this affording him some background against which he might judge the memoranda. I have had in mind May 1st as the target date for the completion of our deposition, taking agency examination, record inquiries, etc., so that we might thereafter begin the preparation of Division 6 of the outline of the Commission's work. So, John Hart Eli, lawyer for the Warren Commission, starts to come up with some data that they don't like. They're going to have to admit some stuff. Okay, and who was this from? Albert Jenner. So obviously Jenner's in on this cover-up. All right. All right, so I was going to cover this file on Marguerite Oswald's discrepancies, but we're getting rather late in the show. So I'm going to hold this off and we will cover this tomorrow. I still need to get back to the last couple chapters of A Mother in History. But like I said, I wasn't really planning on doing a show today. I just felt like I needed to talk for a while. So But that's going to do it for today. And so what we'll do is we will get back to on Monday. We'll do a Mother in History. We'll try to wrap that up. I got about 35 pages to go. Then we'll come back to these Marguerite Oswald discrepancies because she is now the focus of my obsession. And that's going to do it for me, guys. I will talk to you guys later.